In the heart of the Mediterranean, where three continents converge upon ancient stone, cartographers drew an island blazing white as a forged flame, where empires had shattered since the dawn of civilization. Asad ibn al-Furat was never defined by bloodline alone, but by his iron silence before battle, that dreadful stillness, an invisible armor forged where mortal language utterly fails to describe what awaits across the churning water. He was a jurist within his sanctuary and a warlord upon his battlefield. A man past 70, carrying behind his eyes a fire that decades of devotion had never extinguished, but rather fed into a consuming, horizon-devouring inferno. The chronicles remembered him as the scholar who memorized doctrine and taught sacred law. Yet when history summoned him, he cast aside his robes and donned corroded iron armor, as though the steel itself had awaited him since creation's first dawn. When his fleet materialized upon the Byzantine horizon, it seemed not born of mortal hands, but as though the sea itself was hurling its ancient wrath toward the trembling coastline, and the island's fortresses shook before a single Muslim arrow was loosed. In Constantinople, Byzantine princes whispered his name across candlelit tables, and in Rome, cathedral prayers named him as the devil ascending from the southern abyss. Yet he was the farthest thing imaginable from diabolic, being instead an architect of fated destiny. His military doctrine was clean as a drawn sword. No deviation, no deception, landing, consolidation, siege, conquest. 4 iron words summarizing 75 devastating years of blood and gray, choking dust. When the Aghlabids placed the command of the campaign before him, he stood long before the mirror, beholding an old man who carried within his very bearing the memory and the boundless ambition of an entire civilization, and he accepted without a single trembling hesitation. Sicily, that island which had eternally served as crown to whomever commanded the Mediterranean, was the foundation and burial ground of empires alike, the vast granary that fed the armies of both Caesars and ruthless sea predators. In the 9th century it remained under Byzantine dominion, yet that dominion had grown brittle as spider thread riven internally by rebellion and savage fracture, menaced from without by the iron talons of the Aghlabid eagles descending from Africa. The island possessed fortresses carved by Greek engineers deep into mountain lesh, reinforced by the Byzantines with walls of dense black stone, until every minor settlement had become an independent citadel unto itself, brooding and self-sustaining. The Muslims faced not merely an army encamped upon a shoreline, but an interlocking fortress network fed directly from the sea by constant supply. For he who cannot shatter dominion over the waters cannot shatter dominion over the island itself. From Tunisia, the Achads gazed northward and beheld Sicily closer than any other conceivable prize. Only 140 kilometers of salt and wind and raw, consuming ambition separated Kairouan from Palermo's walls. The very geography of the Mediterranean itself dictated the strategic imperative of the march toward the island, for he who controlled Sicily seized the throat of every passage between east and west, severing the commercial and military lifeline of the Byzantine Empire and Tyre. The moment arrived when the treacherous Byzantine commander Euphemius, consumed by his own internal power struggle, threw open the island's gates with his own hand, unknowingly summoning a tide that would never recede until the last stronghold fell. In the year 827 AD, Ziyadat Allah I, Prince of the Aghlabids, sanctioned what Muslims had yearned toward across entire decades, and the host moved northward as one unified, irresistible, world-altering wind of iron and faith. In the spring of 827 AD, Asad ibn al-Furat sailed at the vanguard of 170 vessels cleaving the Mediterranean's dark body, knowing that the sea itself would be his first and most treacherous battlefield before his feet ever touched Sicilian sand. The Aghlabid fleet was no cumbersome armada of imperial leviathans. These were lean, swift, predatory craft built from African timber, purpose-forged to deliver devastating strikes before the enemy's paralyzed mind could even begin formulating its response. Transporting 10,000 warriors across the Strait of Messina was an enterprise worthy of its own dark legend, yet Asad studied the waters as a scholar studies sacred texts, with deliberate, patient, methodical scrutiny until they yielded their secrets without resistance. When the Byzantine watchtower at the coastal heights spotted those incoming vessels moving like a predatory swarm of black eagles, the warning horns rang out. Yet the response came too late, for in war, a single wasted moment is the abyss between defense and utter collapse. The Byzantines did not delay in marshalling their response. Upon the island's southwestern coastline at Mazara, a massive Byzantine battle formation assembled itself to cut the landing route, and Sicily's first true reckoning erupted before any Muslim warrior's feet had dried from the breaking surf. Asad and his soldiers fought with legs still burning with salt, and hearts hammering beneath the crushing weight of the purpose carried from Kairouan. The first battle was brutal and ferocious, yet it granted the Muslims their foothold upon the island's flesh, and that was all history demanded of them. Asad burned his ships after the landing. Accounts diverge in their particulars, yet the incontestable truth remains that he sealed the road of retreat by pure sovereign will, scattering from his soldiers' souls every whisper of withdrawal through the consuming fire of burning timber drifting upon the waves. He stood before his warriors as they watched dark smoke rising from the last burning hull and spoke words meaning, "Behind us lies the sea. Before us lie our enemies." Nothing remains but that this moment be either paradise or victory, a will born in that instant that no tide or pestilence could ever break. Asad drove his vanguard towards Syracuse, the jewel and fortified mind of all Sicily, that ancient city before whose walls the Athenians and Carthaginians of old had both been broken and driven back in bleeding, shattered humiliation. The walls of Syracuse ranked among the most astonishing achievements of all medieval military engineering. Layered, vast, commanding a harbor strangled shut by iron chains to deny entry to hostile vessels, guarded by a garrison that understood precisely how to bleed an enemy with patient, methodical slowness. The Muslims pressed the siege with its full crushing weight, yet plague advanced between them and their victory. A killing pestilence swept through the Muslim encampment and harvested lives indiscriminately, and Asad ibn al-Furat himself was among those consumed by this merciless, invisible enemy. Asad ibn al-Furat died before the walls of Syracuse in 828 AD, never entering it as a conqueror. Yet he died facing forward, confronting his enemies, never turning his back upon the abyss, and that endures as an achievement surpassing many victories counted complete and total. The Islamic armies did not dissolve upon their commander's death. Therein lay the fundamental distinction between armies built upon men and armies built upon an indestructible cause. For these warriors fought in service of something immeasurably greater than any single mortal, however magnificent his stature. Command passed after Asad to many who followed an unbroken succession, rolling upon Sicily like waves that know no exhaustion, while reinforcements from Tunisia arrived with precise clockwork regularity, the sea serving as the vital umbilical cord sustaining this prolonged, relentless, multi-generational campaign. Palermo, Panormus, the city bearing the ancient epithet "flower of the Mediterranean," with its thundering markets and soaring churches and its harbor that never truly slept, was the supreme prize justifying decades of iron sacrifice and hardship and blood. In 831 AD, after a siege enduring nearly a full year, Palermo's ancient walls shattered beneath what the Muslims had accumulated through sheer unyielding patience and iron determination, and the Muslim host poured into the city like a river finally breaching its dam after long captivity. The fall of Palermo was no mere military triumph. It was a geopolitical convulsion that struck all of Europe with thunderous, paralyzing disbelief, for he who held Palermo held the master key of all Sicily, and he who held Sicily closed his iron fist around the entire western Mediterranean's jugular. Palermo was transformed into an Islamic capital at a pace that astonished the chroniclers. Mosques rose beside standing churches, markets were organized according to the disciplined mercantile patterns of Kairouan, and scholars and merchants and artists converged from every quarter of the Islamic world. The Strait of Messina was the great vein pumping living blood into Islamic Sicily, separating the island from Italy by a mere 3 kilometers of dark, churning water, too narrow to resist and far too perilous to ever disregard or leave unguarded. Control of the strait was no mere tactical security arrangement. It was sovereignty over the very breath of every vessel attempting to navigate the Western Mediterranean, for nothing passed without the permission of the island's armed, watchful, iron-willed garrison. When the Muslims secured their iron grip upon Messina, the long-awaited ease of supplying the campaign became reality without resistance. The geographic proximity to Africa made every supply vessel feel as though it departed from a neighboring harbor rather than crossing an entire continental distance. The Muslims raised fortresses in Messina that generations inherited and reinforced across centuries, gazing simultaneously upon both shores, frightened Italy staring anxiously southward, and Islamic Sicily driving its roots ever deeper into the sea's dark body and the island's ancient conquered earth. Syracuse, the last great Byzantine stronghold, endured in resistance for 75 years after the first landing, standing as a monument to human stubbornness and the capacity to withstand a tide that seemed utterly and eternally unstoppable. In 902 AD, Ibrahim II, Prince of the Aghlabids, completed what Asad had begun 75 years before. He laid siege to Syracuse, its final beating heart and its last remaining lifeline, and it resisted him. And then it fell broken into the dust. When the Muslims entered Syracuse, it was not the entrance of a triumphant lord preening in glory, but rather the entrance of those honoring an ancient trust, a burden carried by the first generation and inherited by each successive generation until the hour appointed arrived in the hands of he whom God had decreed would complete it. In that moment, the island had entered fully beneath the shadow of Islam, and minarets rose upon a skyline that had known only crosses, and the call to prayer pierced the silence of mountains that had witnessed every civilization that had ever risen and fallen and returned to dust. What the Muslims wrought in Sicily after the conquest was no less astonishing than what they had wrought upon the field of war. They transformed a parched and arid island into an agricultural paradise through the construction of irrigation channels, some traces of which persist in the Sicilian earth to this very day. The Arabs brought to Sicily the orange and the lemon and the sugarcane and the cotton plant and the date palm, and they taught the earth itself how to yield its harvest multiple times within a single year, where once it had yielded only once during a barren, exhausted season. In Palermo, become Panormus, the city of 1,000 mosques, as awestruck European travelers described it in expressions of barely coherent wonder. Philosophy and medicine and mathematics were taught openly in the Arabic tongue, in academies that preceded European universities by entire centuries. The great traveler Ibn Hawqal, when he visited Islamic Sicily in the 10th century, found there what he had found in very few of the known world's great capitals: disciplined intellectual plurality, widely distributed knowledge, and an urban architecture that made its inhabitants the envy of every lesser civilization. The terms of civilized tolerance imposed by the Muslim conquerors were, in actual practice, considerably more elevated and just than anything Europe had known in its long history of dealing with the defeated other. Byzantine Christians lived, worshipped, and endured in relative peace and dignity. This mercy was no weakness. It was the profound political wisdom of governors who understood that peoples are not truly conquered by the sword alone, and that the true road toward the hearts of the island's inhabitants passed through justice long before it passed through force. The truth that too many historians have neglected to examine is that the conquest of Sicily was simply impossible without the Aghlabids possessing a fully integrated naval apparatus capable of sustaining a prolonged campaign across more than 7 unbroken decades. Supply vessels sailed from Tunisia to Sicily on a near-weekly rhythm, transporting warriors and provisions and weapons and horses in a logistical supply chain that refused to halt even when the winter Mediterranean raged with its full and terrible fury. When the Byzantines dispatched their own war fleets to sever these supply lines, the Aghlabids repelled them in repeated naval engagements in which the African Muslims demonstrated conclusively that the sea was their domain by right as much as it was the Byzantines' domain by long and established practice. The Strait of Messina served a dual and irreplaceable function, shielding Islamic Sicily from northern Italian penetration while simultaneously opening a corridor through which raiding forces could strike the southern Italian coastlines that lived under the perpetual and crushing weight of dread. Islamic raiding forces from Sicily struck as far as the coastlines of the Italian peninsula itself, and Muslim warriors even established a fortified encampment near Naples, a settlement that terrified the Roman Church to the very foundation of its institutional existence. When the Normans reclaimed Sicily in the 11th century, they did something profoundly unexpected. They did not obliterate what the Muslims had constructed, but rather inherited it, continued within it, and absorbed it entirely into the fabric of their own emerging civilization. King Roger II, the Catholic Norman, governed his court in Arabic alongside Latin and Greek, employing Muslim ministers and relying upon cartographers such as the great geographer al-Idrisi, who drew for the known world its most precise and enduring map of all the medieval centuries. Al-Idrisi, who produced the most accurate map of the known world in the 12th century, was a Muslim Arab scholar working in the court of a Christian Norman king in what had been Islamic Sicily, and that extraordinary convergence stands as one of civilization's most luminous monuments in all its recorded history. Sicilian words of Arabic origin, which modern Italians assume to be purely native Italian inheritance, form a deep and ancient linguistic stratum throughout southern Italy, standing as silent testimony to 3 centuries of shared coexistence, construction, and collaborative creative achievement. The Islamic architectural legacy of Sicily was never erased. It was fused into what historians call the Arab-Norman style, that singular and unparalleled synthesis blending the pointed Islamic arch and the ornate geometric arabesque with the Christian ecclesiastical structure, a fusion without equal in the annals of world art. What does the conquest of Sicily declare to us today, 12 centuries after those northward sailing waves carried a 70-year-old commander and an ambition that knew no aging, no surrender, and no comprehension of what retreat might mean? It declares that great causes are never decided in a single day, and that 75 years of armed, disciplined, unyielding endurance represent the true and inescapable price of those colossal victories that permanently alter the face of all recorded history. It declares that a true commander does not perish even when his body falls. For Asad died before Syracuse, yet his spirit marched with Muslim armies for 75 years, until what his aged hands had begun was brought to its appointed and inevitable completion. It declares that the sea is no barrier before those who have resolved in the depths of their being that the crossing is an obligation and never a choice, and that burning one's ships is sometimes the greatest decision a commander ever makes, igniting within hearts what no tide or plague can ever extinguish. It declares that civilization is more dangerous than any army, for armies come and armies go, but civilization descends like roots into the earth's body and endures across the centuries, persisting even in the very speech of the grandchildren of those who once took up arms against you. Sicily did not fall, it ripened. And those who contemplate its long trajectory come to understand that the Mediterranean was always a stage and never a barrier, and those who mastered it with knowledge and will and patience dictated to history precisely what they chose. The Islamic memory in Sicily is not measured by demolished mosques or by minarets converted into church bells. It is measured by the island itself, which to this very day carries within its soil and its agriculture and its village names and its ancient water channels an imprint that 10 centuries of storms could never fully scour away. And this, dear listeners, is the true conquest, not the moment you enter the city, but the moment you remain within it long after you yourself have gone.